right. So my name is Morgan. I'm at the Harnett campus, although I do sometimes make it down to Lee. So this is something that is, I think, really interesting about research is that there are so many different diverse materials that students can use. It is just really a matter of answering some questions that we might have about using those resources, and then also helping students answer questions that they might have about those resources. So if you have anything you want to add or contribute or share throughout the session, please feel free. So the learning outcomes for this particular session are identifying appropriate multimedia resources for students' research projects. What I mean by appropriate is whatever you have determined for your own course and what that looks like. And then identify the advantages of multimedia sources in students' research projects. I'm going to bring up some things that I think are advantages. You might say, no way, that's just not fitting for my class. And that is totally great. It is really a matter of what are the advantages for your particular context. This is obviously a very broad discussion, but I hope that in talking about things in this kind of way, it provides you with some support about things you might consider doing in your classes. So in order to kind of navigate this session, I've really organized it by three main questions, which are what do diverse sources offer to our knowledge in academia? What makes a source credible? And then what kinds of questions are students asking? And the reason I want to do it as a set of questions is that I don't have all the answers. And that really research is about being curious and learning more. And so I hope that by framing things as questions, we can really think about it as a lifelong learning, continual improvement, constant growth experience. So let's start with the diversity of resources that are out there. Now, you're very familiar with newspapers and magazines and websites, books, professional association and trade journals are probably starting to get a little less familiar. And when we think about scholarly sources, I think that they are really great resources, obviously, to use when you're having a scholarly discussion. But let's pause really quick. Why do you think that we do in academia tend to rely so heavily on scholarly journals instead of, say, maybe these current modes of research that we have here on the screen? Newspapers, magazines, websites, books, professional association, trade journals. They're still pretty academic and still fairly, relevant to a lot of different kinds of research, pretty traditional in a lot of ways. So what makes us rely more on scholarly sources, do you think? Yes, I totally agree. I think that because they've been peer-reviewed and fact-checked by supposed experts, it feels safer. Basically, you've got a safety net. You know that they have been ensured to be what we would perceive to be credible. And so it just takes out some of the work that I think students may feel a little overwhelmed by. That's a great point. Any other reason you can think of why scholarly journals might tend to be a little bit more?
Yeah, I think the people conducting the research and providing the information are usually more well-educated in the field. They're usually professionals in the field. And sometimes with websites and other things, you're not as confident in that. Right.
That's a great point. I think that's a great point. I think it makes perfect sense. Now, after these sources that I've got listed here on the screen now, I'm going to start moving into things that are going to be a little bit less traditional. So the first one, nonprofit hobby association publications, including newsletters, videos, films, documentaries. That's a little bit more acceptable, but still can be a little challenging to incorporate podcasts, reference materials, artwork and music, poetry, government documents. And some of these we don't use just because students do sometimes, I think, feel overwhelmed. They're like, they look at a government document and they're like, what is this? It's just because it's not familiar. So some of it is not so much that one is better than the other. It's really just a matter of students do have a hard time distinguishing credible and non-credible sources and sites. Yeah, that's a really great point. One thing I wanted to highlight about podcast and poetry in particular is that with podcasts, they're not typically resources that we would typically, or that we would think of in a scholarly research paper or a student research paper, but there are so many different diverse podcasts now. It feels like anybody can make a podcast, right? If you're a millennial, you've made a podcast or you thought about it. If you're not a millennial, you have definitely thought about making a podcast too. So it's really not so much that incorporating these sources makes it easier to fact check or to distinguish between credible and non-credible sources. It's that in a lot of ways, because there is so much more diversity, you're getting a lot of different perspectives. And that can inform some of the ways that students do research. So here's an example. This is Stitcher. Offers a lot of different genres of podcasts. Obviously, if you got like Apple Play, you can listen to podcasts there too. But just to give you an example, there are tons of great podcasts on Southern foodways that are available through Stitcher. There are so many wonderful examinations of culture when it comes to Southern food. And podcasts are really, really interesting and compelling because a lot of times they contain interviews with people that are experiencing or working on hand in these activities. So what does a podcast where a student can hear different interviews and different perspectives from different people and their different voices, both figuratively and literally, how they sound versus reading it on a page. Does it make it more or less credible? No. But does it give that conversation a little bit more insight to the fact that these are not just researchers and scholars, they're actually people doing that research and scholarship. Does that make sense? I don't know if I said that super clear, but it gives students that more human element of issues that are currently happening. And the wonderful thing about podcasts is that they can come out a little bit more quickly than, say, the process of a scholarly article. Again, it's not the same kind of research necessarily, but it can inform students' research as they're thinking about their topic, both in the past and now. Yes, yeah, absolutely, Allison. I would love to hear it.
When you said that, it made me think of it. My microphone might have fallen. So in 112 this fall, I had my students look at different sources of scientific writing than just journals. I have to say a lot of them, and I gave them prescribed podcasts, ones that had are known for being scientifically correct, but a lot of them were like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, I enjoy learning science this way. And I feel like, I didn't say this earlier, but it popped in my head while you were talking. I don't remember what exactly you said, jiggled this. But I feel like, we stick with professional journals and stuff like scholarly journals because like, that's what we were taught to do. But like you said, there's so much they could learn outside of it, like through just as reputable, but different things. So like Unbiased Science Podcast is a group of unbiased scientists. Well, they say they're unbiased. But they also make Instagram posts that are like, they provide you their references and everything, but like why would that be less credible coming from them than their actual journal? So it's just interesting to see this semester already how my students engaged better with these different types of sources.
That's a really great point. Thank you for sharing that. It's nice to hear it works in practice. I'm going to show you another thing as well, which is the ways in which I highlighted poetry, for example. So we might not typically think about poetry as contributing as much to a scholarly argument, except if we're like doing an analysis of it. But let's say a student is learning about surveillance and surveillance culture. And what does it mean to be surveilled? I actually used to do this when I was at UNCG, and when I was teaching, I would show them all these different things that was kind of talked about that surveillance is a bad thing. Nobody wants to be surveilled. But then I found this poem and I shared it with them the next day, and I'm going to drop it in the chat. Feel free to take a look. It provides a really succinct counter argument for why, or counter argument against why surveillance may not necessarily be bad. You don't have to agree with it, right? But some scholarly journals and articles and some research does tend to lean pretty heavily towards one side of the argument, and it's hard for students sometimes to find information that might be counter argument. Some of that is for legitimate reasons, and then sometimes it's just not something that they're finding. Could a poem serve as a reasonable counter argument? I don't think that there is necessarily an answer. I think the answer is what works for your context. But you can see there are different ways of presenting different arguments that still could be useful in the way students learn and address research and make arguments and analyze information. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So what do diverse sources offer to our knowledge in of academia? We've already kind of talked about this, but feel free to drop your answer into the chat or mute and share your ideas. Allison, you shared a really great point about podcasts, and that it helps students to feel like really engaged in learning science where they might not have wanted to learn it by just reading a scholarly article. Anybody else sort of have a perspective on that, what they have tried or used or want to share?
In my public speaking, I really like students to use government statistics.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they have to read government documents. Sometimes it's on the website.
Right.
But, you know, when you're trying to get people's attention, especially at the beginning of a speech with the attention getter,
Yeah.
Statistics are often a really good way to do that. So
that's a great point.
But I haven't thought of some of these other places that they could get statistics from too, which is interesting.
Oh, yes, that is a good point. If you end up moving in that direction, I'd love to hear where you end up or where you go. So one of the reasons that I really wanted to present this particular topic is, well, there's actually a couple of reasons, but the first is that the perspective on information is shifting in libraries. Not me personally, but the ACRL, which is the Association of College and Research Libraries, adopted frames for information literacy in 2016, which really revised the way that we taught in libraries information literacy and how students could approach information literacy. I've actually dropped that link into the chat there. Feel free to read through it. But the first point is that authority is constructed and contextual, meaning that it's acknowledging certain ways that we perceive information, but also certain power structures that are in place to promote certain kinds of information and to maybe not promote other kinds of information. And that can also be the genre, the format by which we consume information. And so as you think about authority as constructed and contextual, and as we think about the different kinds of questions that students can ask and different sources and what they offer, that authority and how we perceive authority may shift. So one of the reasons I wanted to present this is that as information becomes more diverse, but also as formats become more diverse, students will probably start to see more and more of this kind of content competing in some ways with scholarly journals. Maybe not necessarily the same kind of credentials and degrees by the authors, but the content and how it's presented. Which one's more engaging? Which one do students understand more effectively? Which one ultimately contributes to the students' learning? And when we get to the end, I'll kind of talk about that it's not really an either or question. So what makes a source credible? Typically, we would think about the CRAP test, which is currency, reliability, authority, and purpose. You might also have heard of authority, bias, currency, and documentation. So the ABCD test. Some people just do the first three, authority, bias, and currency, so ABC. If there is a checklist for evaluating a source, a librarian has probably come up with it. It's out there. There's also another one. There's SIFT, which is stop, investigate, find, and trace. So that can be really useful for web objects and items. I'm going to actually drop that information into the chat so that you can check that out as well. So here's the SIFT process as a whole. And then here's a link for lateral reading and how to do that. And I will say, if you or your students are ever interested in lateral reading and you want to see a demonstration, the library will always be happy to provide a demonstration as well. All three of these checklists or tests or processes, whatever you want to call them, are different ways of evaluating information. When it comes to diverse sources, I think that it's not so much that you do just one. It's again, authority is contextual and constructed. So it's really more about tinkering with the evaluation and considering the source. So a podcast might pass the ABCD test. Does it make it credible? Maybe, maybe not. There's lots of different ways to think about how a source could pass any one of these different evaluation techniques. So it's mostly thinking about whether you're constructing the assignment as the instructor or whether you are the student receiving the assignment, that there's an agreement about what that credibility looks like within that particular context, within that particular genre of information or format of that source. Just an agreement that here's the playing field, here's how we have agreed to evaluate this information, and then going from there. There's lots of podcasts that I really like Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History. That I love that one. But, you know, people will have definitely argued that he extrapolates a lot of personal anecdotes and individual stories from larger data sets that may not necessarily always are not always easily replicated or may not always represent the majority, but I may not necessarily be using it in that particular way. Maybe I'm using it to represent the ways that we that narrative works in presentation of data. Then it works really great for what I need it for. So it's agreeing on what are the ground rules for how we evaluate, for the assignment, for how we're going to use this source. And that is hard for students. I think it's challenging to know what to do next with the source. But that's what the Writing Center can help with, the library can help with. We can help students find that information and then sort of think about, well, how's it going to fit in your research? What do you want to do with it? And then helping them to find whatever's going to meet their information need. Does that make sense? Great. So the final question that I was thinking about are what kinds of questions are students currently asking? And then what kinds of questions could they be asking? And I don't know if this is true, so I'd love to hear your feedback. But when I think about the kinds of questions that students ask and the information they want to know and how they find that information, do you think that if they're limited to just finding scholarly information or scholarly articles, more like, do you think that limits the kinds of questions that they ask? Do you think it expands or broadens the kind of questions that they ask? What are your thoughts on that? Yes, I think, yeah, it can definitely, I think you're right. It expands and broadens. And then I think you're right, Allison, that they do feel limited whether or not they actually are limited. So they hear scholarly articles and they think, I don't even know where to go from this point. So sometimes you guys have brought up a really great point, which is the experience and the reality is sometimes different than how we feel about it or our perspective on it. So I think that when students are asking these kinds of questions, there are probably a lot of questions that actually benefit from both kinds of information, meaning scholarly traditional information like scholarly articles and information that is in a different format like artwork or poetry or podcasts or documentaries. So consider this research question, and I have to go ahead and say that I'm like super interested in birds right now. If you have spent more than 15 minutes around me, I have probably brought it up at some point. So what is causing the destruction of brown-headed nuthatches environment? What are some solutions to this problem? So that's my sort of research question. This is a research question that I have recently just become interested in. So it's not one that I had really thought about much before like 3 months ago. So I did a little bit of searching in the library. And you can see here the first things I looked at were scholarly articles, brown-headed nuthatches or nuthatches, and the environment. And I tried all of these different kinds of combinations that I could find related to brown-headed nuthatches. So I'm going to show you just the first results here. I was thoroughly pleased by what I found in many ways. Like you can see here, this is about brown-headed nuthatches, as well as environmental factors affecting productivity in brown-headed nuthatches. So that could definitely answer my research question. But after I start to move down the page, I started to notice that there were references to the brown-headed nuthatch every once in a while, but then it just started to be pretty broad, just nuthatches in general, just any old nuthatch that we can find. And that may not necessarily be relevant to my research because I specifically want to know about these types of birds in the United States. So then I decided, okay, I'm going to focus on the United States. Again, I found really good information, but it started to get a little bit more limited as I moved down the page. There's really not quite as many scholarly articles that are relevant to this particular research question. There's a couple, but not quite as many if I want to see a wide diversity of perspectives. And I got some similar results with these other two searches. You can see I got a little bit more specific with the kind of environment destruction that I was referring to, and then some solutions. Versus, say, the nonprofit association, the Audubon Society, I found 10,000 nest boxes for nuthatches. That's a YouTube video. It actually talks about statistically what we have here in North Carolina and the solutions for protecting those birds. And then this one actually provides some information about the bird, what it needs, step-by-step instructions, why they need help, and then some fact sheets. So is this peer-reviewed? No. But is it something that I feel would be credible to a research paper about this particular research question? Yeah, I think so. And I think it comes from the fact that this is a hobbyist group. They may have, scholars working for and with them, but it's also collective knowledge. It's also a lot of people that are really, really passionate about birds, writing and working together to engage their communities about this particular topic. So all of this to say, where am I going with this? So which one should students use? It's not necessarily a matter of either or. This question really aligns more with the technique yes and. And what that basically means is yes to all of that. And let's keep going. Let's see what else we can find that contributes to that research or contributes to that learning. And so a student on their own, if they were asking the research question about nuthatches, they might not know about the Audubon Society, but the library could help. We could say, what are you trying to find? And they're saying, I'm just looking for some hobbyist organizations or some people that know about these particular birds and that it's a credible information. We can find you scholarly sources, but we can also look more broadly and widely at what else is out there that may still contribute to that student's learning and how they answer that question. Does that make sense? Are scholarly journals great together? Great by themselves? Sure. Are these websites and newsletters and YouTube videos great by themselves? Sure, absolutely. But together, they can really complement one another from the scholarly perspective and the more specific solutions that might answer that research question. And that's really what I noticed is that the scholarly research was great. It really identified the problem really well, but the solutions were kind of vague. There were references to nest boxes. There were references to other things you can do, but the Audubon Society information was a lot more specific. Here's what you can actually do. Here's the step-by-step process for the solutions to answering part of your question. So together, they really make a stronger argument as a whole. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So feel free to share your thoughts. I'm going to put a link into the chat. It is just a kind of some feedback. If you're like, I have something I really want to say, but I don't really want to chat about it right here in Zoom, that's totally fine. You can put it there. If you're like, I think it'd be kind of fun if we found some professional associations related to, certain careers or hobbyist organizations related to certain topics to help in your class, we would love to do that. Helping you find credible sources that are diverse and help support your students' learning is absolutely what we would love to do. And here's some contact information. And feel free to email us or call.